June 4, 1944, mid-Atlantic, 150 miles off the coast of West Africa. The ocean stretches endlessly in every direction, empty and hostile. Aboard USS Guadalcanal, a small escort carrier barely 500 feet long, Captain Daniel Gallery paces the bridge with barely contained tension. His task group has been hunting a single U-boat for 17 hours. Below deck, destroyer escorts Pillsbury, Pope Flaherty, and Chatelaine circle like wolves, their sonar pinging methodically through the depths. Above TBF Avenger aircraft orbit at 1,500 feet, their crews scanning the water with binoculars and radar. This is not a convoy escort mission. This is not defensive warfare. This is a hunter-killer group in action, and they are closing in for the kill. Suddenly, destroyer escorts Chatelain's sonar operator calls out contact at 800 yards. The submarine is rising. Captain Gallery grabs his radio and transmits a single word to all ships: attack. What happens in the next 90 minutes will result in the only intact capture of an enemy submarine during the entire war. An intelligence coup that will help shorten the conflict and validate a revolutionary new concept in naval warfare. This is the story of how hunter-killer groups transformed the Battle of the Atlantic from a desperate, defensive struggle into an aggressive hunting campaign that destroyed the U-boat threat forever. The hunter-killer group represented one of the most significant tactical innovations in naval history, yet its development was born from crisis and desperation. By the spring of 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its darkest hour. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, operating with near impunity in what submariners called the second happy time. The convoy system, while providing some protection, was fundamentally reactive. Escorts circled merchant ships defensively, responding to attacks but rarely achieving kills. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving, with over 200 operational U-boats by late 1942, and each submarine capable of sinking multiple merchant ships before being destroyed. The Allies were losing a war of attrition. Admiral Karl Dönitz' Wolfpack tactics exploited the fundamental weakness of convoy escorts. They had to stay with the merchants. A U-boat pack could shadow a convoy for days, attacking at night when visibility was poor, then diving and escaping while the escorts were tied to protecting the surviving ships. The average convoy escort achieved a U-boat kill rate of approximately 5 to 7% per attack. At this rate, destroying the U-boat fleet would take years, and Britain would starve long before victory was achieved. The solution emerged from a simple but radical premise: stop waiting for U-boats to attack convoys and start hunting them aggressively across the Atlantic. But this required capabilities that conventional warships lacked. Destroyers were too large, too slow to build, and too valuable to risk on extended hunting patrols far from convoys. Cruisers were even more expensive and vulnerable to submarine attack themselves. What was needed was a platform that could provide air cover and command facilities, paired with fast, economical escort vessels that could be produced in large numbers. The answer came into revolutionary ship types that would define the hunter-killer concept: the escort carrier and the destroyer escort. Neither ship type existed in meaningful numbers when America entered the war in December 1941, yet by 1943, they would be rolling off production lines in numbers that would astound even their designers and terrify the German submarine command. The escort carrier, designated CVE by the US Navy and nicknamed combustible, vulnerable, and expendable by their crews, was born from British desperation and American industrial might. The British had pioneered the concept in 1941 with HMS Audacity, a converted merchant ship carrying 6 aircraft. Audacity proved the concept before being torpedoed in December 1941, but not before demonstrating that even a handful of aircraft operating with a convoy could dramatically reduce U-boat effectiveness. The Americans took this concept and industrialized it, using C-3 cargo ship hulls. Shipyards installed flight decks, hangar facilities, and basic carrier equipment. The result was a ship approximately 500 feet long with a displacement of 7,800 tons that could carry 2 for 2.8 aircraft and steam at 19 knots. These were not fleet carriers. They lacked armor, speed, and the defensive capabilities of their larger cousins. A single torpedo could sink them. Their flight decks were too short for heavy bombers. Their elevators were slow and temperamental. But they had one overwhelming advantage: they could be built in less than 6 months and cost 1/10 as much as a fleet carrier. The Bogue-class escort carriers, which would form the backbone of US hunter-killer operations, incorporated lessons learned from early British conversions. They carried a typical air group of 12 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and 12 FM-2 Wildcat fighters, though this mix varied based on mission requirements. The Avengers were the primary submarine killers, each capable of carrying 4 depth charges, acoustic homing torpedoes, or bombs. The Wildcats provided combat air patrol and could strafe surfaced submarines with devastating effect from their 6.50 caliber machine guns. The carriers had basic radar systems, including the SK-Air search radar with a range of approximately 100 miles against aircraft, and the surface search radar effective against surfaced submarines out to 20 miles in good conditions. Perhaps most importantly, they served as floating command centers with radio facilities that could coordinate air and surface assets across hundreds of square miles of ocean. Paired with the escort carriers were destroyer escorts, the D designation covering several classes of small, fast warships specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. These vessels represented American shipbuilding at its most pragmatic and efficient. At approximately 300 feet long and displacing 1,200 to 1,400 tons, they were smaller and slower than fleet destroyers, but they were also cheaper, quicker to build, and optimized for submarine hunting rather than fleet actions. A typical destroyer escort like the Buckley class carried 3 3-inch guns, depth charge racks and projectors, and the revolutionary Hedgehog forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon. They were powered by diesel-electric or turboelectric drive systems that gave them 20 to 21 knots maximum speed and excellent fuel economy, critical for extended operations far from friendly ports. Their sonar systems were and their crews were trained extensively in anti-submarine tactics before deployment. The combination of escort carrier and destroyer escorts created a task group with unprecedented capabilities. The carrier provided long-range detection and strike capability through its aircraft, which could search 200 to 300 miles from the task group and attack submarines before they could submerge or escape. The destroyer escorts provided close-in protection for the carrier and served as the killing arm once a submarine was located and damaged by air attack. Together, they could search vast areas of ocean, respond rapidly to intelligence reports about EO boat positions, and pursue contacts until kills were achieved, something convoy escorts could never do because they were tied to protecting merchant ships. The strategic implications were enormous. Instead of waiting for U-boats to attack convoys and then responding defensively, hunter-killer groups could take the fight to the enemy, disrupting patrol lines, forcing submarines to remain submerged where they were slow and blind, and creating a zone of control that denied the Germans freedom of movement. The first American hunter-killer group became operational in March 1943, built around the escort carrier USS Bogue under Captain Giles Short. Bogue's task group consisted of the carrier and 4 destroyer escorts, Osmond Ingram, George E. Badger, and Green. Their mission was simple in concept but enormously challenging in execution. Patrolled the Central Atlantic, hunt for U-boats, transiting to and from their operational areas, and kill as many submarines as possible. The task group's operational area covered approximately 400,000 square miles of ocean, and finding submarines in this vast expanse required integrating multiple intelligence sources, sophisticated search patterns, and relentless persistence. Their first patrol in March-April 1943 established the template that would be refined over the next 2 years. Bogue operated in a patrol box approximately 200 miles on each side, maintaining a combat air patrol of at least 2 aircraft at all times during daylight hours. Additional aircraft launched for specific searches based on intelligence reports, RADIO, direction finding bearings on U-boat transmissions, or sightings by convoy escorts operating nearby. The tactical coordination required between carrier and escorts was unprecedented in naval warfare. The carrier needed protection from submarine attack, requiring the destroyer escorts to screen her continuously while also being ready to sprint to distant contacts detected by aircraft. This meant the escorts patrolled in a circular screen around the carrier at distances of 2,000 to 5,000 yards, close enough to respond to threats, but far enough that they wouldn't interfere with flight operations or each other's sonar. When aircraft detected a submarine, the tactical picture became dynamic and complex. The aircraft would attack immediately with depth charges or machine gun fire if the submarine was on the surface, attempting to damage it enough to prevent diving or at least slow its escape. Simultaneously, the aircraft would radio the submarine's position, course, and speed back to the carrier. The carrier's Combat Information Center would plot the contact and vector the nearest destroyer escort to intercept. The escort would steam at maximum speed to the contact area, guided by radio updates from the circling aircraft. Upon arrival, the escort would gain sonar contact if the submarine had dived, or engage with gunfire if it remained on the surface, with the aircraft continuing to attack until the surface ship could take over the kill. This level of coordination required extensive training and communication discipline that was not initially present. Early patrols saw aircraft and surface ships interfering with each other, depth charge attacks damaging friendly ships that approached too close, and confusion about who had tactical command in fluid situations. Doctrine evolved rapidly through harsh experience. By mid-1943, standardized procedures governed every aspect of hunter-killer operations. Aircraft attacking a surfaced submarine would approach from the submarine's stern quarter, minimizing exposure to anti-aircraft fire while maximizing the likelihood of damaging the submarine's diving controls and propulsion. Depth charges were dropped in sticks of 4, spaced 60 to 100 feet apart, to create an overlapping pattern of explosions. If the submarine dived before the attack could be completed, the aircraft would mark the dive position with smoke floats or dive markers, then orbit at 1,500 to 2,000 feet to avoid interfering with the escort's sonar while maintaining visual contact on the marker. Bogue's first confirmed kill came on May 22, 1943, when aircraft from her air group sank U-569 approximately 400 miles northeast of Newfoundland. The engagement exemplified the hunter-killer concept in action. An Avenger piloted by Lieutenant William Fowler detected U-569 on radar at 12 miles, while the submarine was transiting on the surface at night. Using darkness as concealment, Fowler approached low and fast, dropping 4 depth charges from 50 feet altitude that straddled the submarine as it attempted a crash dive. The explosions ruptured the U-boat's pressure hull, and it sank within minutes. The entire engagement from detection to kill lasted less than 4 minutes. No surface ship was involved. The submarine had no opportunity to attack a convoy or even transmit a warning. This was precisely the type of aggressive, proactive warfare that Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, had envisioned when authorizing the hunter-killer concept. By taking the war to the U-boats in their transit areas, hunter-killer groups forced German submarines to remain submerged for longer periods, reducing their speed and operational radius. Submarines that would normally transit on the surface at 17 knots were forced to crawl at 7 knots submerged, dramatically reducing their effectiveness and increasing their vulnerability. The second major hunter-killer group to achieve notable success was built around USS Card, another Bogue-class escort carrier commissioned in November 1942. Card's commander, Captain Arnold Buster Isbell, was an aggressive tactician who pushed his pilots and escorts to their operational limits. Between August and October 1943, Card's task group sank 9 U-boats, making it the most successful hunter-killer group in the Atlantic during that period. Isbell pioneered night operations, keeping aircraft airborne around the clock by installing primitive landing lights on Card's flight deck and training his pilots in instrument flying and night carrier landings, both extremely dangerous on a small escort carrier that pitched heavily in Atlantic swells. The risk was justified by results. German submarines preferred to transit and charge batteries on the surface at night, believing themselves safe from air attack in darkness. Card's night-flying Avengers, equipped with improved radar and searchlights, shattered this assumption. U-boats detected on radar would be illuminated by searchlights at the last moment, giving the submarine no time to dive before depth charges were released. One of Card's most dramatic engagements occurred on the night of August 11, 1943. When Lieutenant Robert Williams detected U-664 on surface search radar at 8 miles, Williams approached at wave-top height with his searchlight off, using radar returns to guide his approach. At 1 mile, he switched on the searchlight, bathing the submarine in brilliant white light. The U-boat's deck watch, blinded and stunned, barely had time to shout a warning before Williams for depth charges exploded alongside the submarine's hull. U-664 broke in half and sank in less than 30 seconds. Williams circled back and illuminated the area with parachute flares, but there were no survivors. The submarine had been caught so completely by surprise that her crew had no opportunity to abandon ship or even seal the boat's hatches before the ocean poured in. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was profound. The night, previously their sanctuary, had become as dangerous as daylight. German patrol reports from late 1943 repeatedly mention fear of night air attacks and reluctance to surface even when batteries were critically low. The British Royal Navy developed their own hunter-killer groups in parallel with American efforts, though with different organizational structures and tactical emphases. British escort carriers were typically slightly larger than their American counterparts, converted from merchant hulls with more extensive modifications that gave them better seakeeping and slightly higher speeds. HMS Biter, Activity, and Tracker were among the first British escort carriers assigned to dedicated anti-submarine hunter-killer missions, operating primarily in the Eastern Atlantic and approaches to Britain. British tactical doctrine emphasized closer integration with shore-based intelligence and submarine tracking organizations like the Admiralty's Submarine Tracking Room. Rather than operating independently in large patrol areas, British hunter-killer groups were often directed to specific locations where intelligence indicated U-boat presence, either through radio direction finding, ultra-intercepts of German naval codes, or reports from other naval forces. The coordination between intelligence and operations reached extraordinary levels of sophistication by 1944. The Submarine Tracking Room in London maintained a plot showing estimated positions of every U-boat in the Atlantic, updated continuously based on all available intelligence sources. When signals intelligence indicated a U-boat was in a specific area, or when direction finding triangulated a submarine's position based on its radio transmissions, this information was immediately radioed to the nearest hunter-killer group with orders to proceed to that location and search. This marriage of intelligence and sea power meant that U-boats were increasingly hunted based on specific, actionable intelligence rather than random searching. A U-boat commander who transmitted a position report or weather observation to U-boat headquarters in France was effectively calling down death upon himself, as the transmission would be intercepted, his position calculated, and a hunter-killer group vectored to that location within hours. Captain Daniel Gallery's USS Guadalcanal task group represented the evolution of the hunter-killer concept to its most refined form. Gallery, an innovative and aggressive officer, commanded not just a single escort carrier, but eventually a task group that included Guadalcanal and up to 6 destroyer escorts, allowing him to divide his forces for multiple simultaneous searches. Gallery was obsessed with capturing a U-boat intact with its code materials and cipher machines, an intelligence coup that would provide unprecedented insight into German naval communications. Throughout 1943 and early 1944, Gallery trained his crews in boarding tactics and capture procedures, preparing for an opportunity that many considered unlikely at best. Standard procedure called for sinking U-boats, not capturing them. A submarine surfacing after being damaged usually scuttled itself within minutes. Even if the crew abandoned ship before scuttling, capturing a half-submerged submarine in heavy Atlantic seas seemed nearly impossible. Gallery's opportunity came on June 4, 1944, when his task group was operating southwest of the Cape Verde Islands. Aircraft from Guadalcanal had detected U-505, a Type IXC submarine commanded by Oberleutnant Harold Langer, through a combination of radar contact and visual sighting. U-505 had been on patrol for 6 weeks and was heading home to France when Guadalcanal's aircraft found her. The initial attack by Wildcat fighters strafing the submarine's deck killed 1 crewman and wounded the commander. U-505 crash-dived but was immediately detected by destroyer escort Chatelain's sonar. Chatelain attacked with a full pattern of 14 depth charges that severely damaged the submarine, rupturing hull plating, smashing gauges, and causing flooding in multiple compartments. The depth charges also knocked out the submarine's diving controls and steering, leaving her unable to maneuver submerged. With no choice remaining, the submarine surfaced among the circling American ships. The crew, believing they were about to be shot or depth charged, abandoned ship immediately, forgetting in their panic to open the boat's seacocks to scuttle her. Gallery had been waiting for precisely this moment. As U-505's crew scrambled into the water, Gallery radioed destroyer Escort Pillsbury with the pre-arranged code word for boarding operations. Within minutes, a volunteer boarding party led by Lieutenant Albert David was rowing toward the wallowing submarine in a small boat. David and 8 sailors climbed onto U-505's deck, while Pillsbury came alongside to provide support. The submarine was sinking slowly, her interior flooded through open hatches and shell holes, water pouring into the control room and forward compartments. The boarding party had minutes at most before the U-boat would sink beneath them. Lieutenant David climbed down the conning tower hatch into water-filled darkness, not knowing if German sailors remained aboard or if scuttling charges were set to detonate. What followed was a desperate race against time. David and his team found the submarine abandoned, but sinking fast. They closed critical valves, sealed flooded compartments, and started pumps, while tons of water continued pouring in. Pillsbury passed over a salvage pump and portable generators. More sailors joined the boarding party. For 6 hours, teams worked in flooded, cramped compartments, while the submarine rolled heavily in Atlantic swells, always on the verge of sinking. Finally, the flooding was controlled, the submarine was stabilized, and Guadalcanal was able to take her in tow. The intelligence haul from U-505 exceeded even Gallery's optimistic projections. The submarine contained intact Enigma cipher machines, codebooks, signal keys, technical manuals describing torpedo guidance systems, detailed charts showing German minefields, and the submarine's complete patrol log. Most critically, the capture was kept absolutely secret. The U-boat's crew was imprisoned in special isolation facilities where they had no contact with other German prisoners. The Germans never learned that U-505 had been captured. They assumed it had been sunk like hundreds of other U-boats. This meant the intelligence material remained valid and could be exploited without the Germans knowing their codes had been compromised. The acoustic torpedo documents from U-505 allowed Allied scientists to develop countermeasures against the Germans' advanced NAT, homing torpedoes that had been sinking increasing numbers of escorts. The capture validated everything Gallery and the hunter-killer concept represented: aggressive pursuit, innovative tactics, intensive training, and the courage to attempt seemingly impossible operations. Beyond the dramatic captures and individual battles, the true measure of hunter-killer group effectiveness lay in their statistical performance. Compared to conventional convoy escorts, analysis of anti-submarine warfare results from 1943-1945 reveals stark differences in effectiveness. Convoy escorts, operating defensively with merchant ships, achieved U-boat kills in approximately 5 to 7% of engagements where contact was made and attack executed. Hunter-killer groups achieved kill rates of 18 to 25% per engagement, roughly 4 times higher. This difference resulted from several factors. Hunter-killer groups could pursue contacts to exhaustion, attacking repeatedly over hours or days until the submarine was destroyed. Convoy escorts had to break off attacks to return to their merchant ships. Hunter-killer aircraft could attack immediately when submarines were detected on the surface, achieving kills before submarines could dive. Convoy escorts typically arrived after submarines had already submerged and taken evasive action. Hunter-killer groups operated with better intelligence about U-boat positions and movements, allowing them to position themselves advantageously. Perhaps most importantly, hunter-killer groups forced U-boats to operate submerged for extended periods, dramatically reducing their effective patrol time and combat efficiency. The monthly statistics tell the story of hunter-killer impact. In May 1943, when the first groups became fully operational, U-boat losses spiked to 41 submarines, more than Germany could replace with new construction. This Black May, as German submariners called it, marked the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. Of the 41 U-boats lost, hunter-killer groups and their aircraft accounted for 14 kills, representing 34% of total losses, despite hunter-killer groups representing less than 10% of Allied anti-submarine forces in the Atlantic. The disproportionate effectiveness continued throughout 1943 and 1944. By the final year of the war, hunter-killer groups were achieving 1 U-boat kill for every 3 patrols, an extraordinary success rate that meant every hunter-killer task group at sea could be expected to sink a submarine every 68 weeks on average. The German response to hunter-killer groups evolved as they recognized the threat. Admiral Dönitz initially believed hunter-killer groups were simply convoy escorts that had been detached to hunt submarines detected near convoys. By late 1943, as U-boat losses mounted and patrol reports described aggressive aircraft operating far from any convoy, Dönitz realized the Allies had created dedicated submarine hunting task forces. His response was to route U-boats away from known hunter-killer operating areas, increase use of schnorkel breathing tubes that allowed submarines to run diesel engines while submerged, and arm U-boats with heavier anti-aircraft weapons to fight back against attacking aircraft. None of these countermeasures proved particularly effective. Routing around hunter-killer groups required U-boats to take longer transit routes, reducing their time on patrol station. Schnorkeling was slow and left a visible wake that aircraft could spot. Heavier anti-aircraft armament made U-boats top-heavy and required them to remain surfaced while under air attack, which was suicidal when facing multiple attacking aircraft. The Type IXC submarine, Germany's long-range U-boat, was particularly vulnerable to hunter-killer groups. These large submarines displaced over 1,100 tons and carried 22 torpedoes, but they were slow to dive, taking 35 to 40 seconds to submerge fully, compared to 25 to 30 seconds for the smaller Type 7. This extra dive time proved fatal when facing aircraft attacks, as many U-boat commanders discovered too late. When a TBF Avenger, diving at 250 knots, released depth charges from 50 feet altitude, the submarine had approximately 8 seconds from the moment the aircraft appeared until the depth charges hit the water. A Type IXC submarine spotted on the surface, with empty ballast tanks, needed at least 35 seconds to dive safely below 50 feet, where depth charge damage was reduced. The mathematics was simple and brutal. The submarine could not dive fast enough to escape. Dozens of Type IXC U-boats were caught in exactly this situation by hunter-killer aircraft, their size and endurance that made them valuable for distant patrols, becoming liabilities that killed them. The technological evolution of hunter-killer capabilities accelerated through 1944 as new equipment reached operational units. Improved radar systems extended detection ranges and reliability. The AN/APS-3 radar installed on Avengers from mid-1944 onward could detect a surfaced submarine at 25 miles in calm conditions and maintain contact during attack runs, allowing pilots to execute radar-guided attacks even in darkness or poor visibility. Acoustic homing torpedoes, designated FIDO by the Americans and Mk-24 officially, gave aircraft a standoff weapon that could track submarines underwater. Dropped by parachute from aircraft, these torpedoes would circle in a descending spiral, listening for submarine propeller noise. When they acquired the target acoustically, they would home in and detonate against the submarine's hull. The psychological effect was devastating. U-boat crews heard the torpedo's high-speed propeller growing louder and closer, knowing that evasive maneuvers were useless because the weapon was actively homing on their acoustic signature. FIDO torpedoes sank at least 31 U-boats between their introduction in May 1943 and war's end. Surface ships also received technological improvements that enhanced hunter-killer effectiveness. The QHB sonar system installed on later destroyer escorts had significantly improved range and discrimination compared to earlier systems, able to detect submarines at 2,500 to 3,000 yards and track them accurately even during evasive maneuvers. The Hedgehog forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon replaced depth charges on many destroyer escorts, increasing kill probability from 5 to 7% per attack to over 20%. Hedgehog fired 24 small contact-fused projectiles ahead of the ship in an elliptical pattern, exploding only when they struck the submarine's hull rather than at predetermined depths like depth charges. This provided immediate confirmation of kills. If you heard explosions, you hit the submarine. If silence, you missed and could immediately reposition for another attack without waiting for depth charge turbulence to subside. Communication integration reached unprecedented levels by 1944. Hunter-killer groups operated with secure radio links to submarine tracking headquarters, allowing real-time intelligence updates and mission retasking based on latest information about U-boat positions. High-frequency direction finding equipment installed on escort carriers and destroyer escorts could triangulate U-boat positions when they transmitted radio messages, providing target locations accurate to within 10 to 20 miles. Task groups could communicate with long-range patrol aircraft operating from bases in Iceland, Britain, and North Africa, coordinating searches over vast ocean areas and passing contacts between air and surface units. This integration of sea power, air power, intelligence, and communications created a network-centric warfare system decades before that term was coined, demonstrating principles that would become foundational to modern military operations. The operational tempo of hunter-killer groups was punishing for crews. A typical patrol lasted 30 to 40 days at sea, operating in all weather conditions across some of the most hostile ocean in the world. Escort carrier flight deck crews worked in rotating shifts around the clock, maintaining aircraft, loading weapons, and conducting flight operations in conditions that would ground land-based squadrons. Destroyer escort crews stood watch continuously, their sonar operators listening for hours at a time to the pinging returns that might indicate a submarine, their lookouts scanning endless grey seas for the telltale feather of wake that could be a periscope or The physical and mental exhaustion was profound. Pilots flew 4 to 6 hour patrols in small, cramped aircraft with minimal creature comforts, navigating over featureless ocean by dead reckoning and crude radio beacons, landing on pitching carrier decks in fog and storms. The danger from weather and operational accidents exceeded the danger from enemy action. More escort carrier aircraft were lost to landing accidents and equipment failures than to German anti-aircraft fire. Yet the results justified the effort and risk. By early 1945, U-boat operations in the Atlantic had been reduced to futility. Submarines that sorted from French and Norwegian bases faced gauntlets of hunter-killer groups, aircraft patrols, and convoy escorts employing tactics and technologies that made successful attacks nearly impossible. The average U-boat patrol in 1945 lasted barely 3 weeks before the submarine was sunk or forced to return to base with damage. Successful torpedo attacks on merchant ships had become rare events rather than routine occurrences. The few U-boats that did reach operational areas found convoys, protected by aircraft and escorts in such numbers that attacking was suicidal. German submarine commanders increasingly reported that completing a patrol without being detected and attacked multiple times was more noteworthy than actually sinking ships. The hunter-killer groups had achieved their strategic objective, not necessarily sinking every U-boat, but making U-boat operations so dangerous and futile that they ceased to threaten Allied logistics and strategy. The human cost of hunter-killer operations, while lower than conventional convoy escort duty, was still significant. 3 escort carriers were lost to submarine attack during the war. USS Block Island torpedoed by U-549. In May 1944, HMS Audacity sunk by U-751 in December 1941, and HMS Avenger torpedoed by U-155 in November 1942. Several destroyer escorts were also lost, including USS Holder torpedoed by U-405, and USS Fechteler sunk by U-967. Aircraft losses mounted steadily, with approximately 180 carrier aircraft lost to all causes during anti-submarine operations between 1943 and 1945, yet compared to merchant ship losses that exceeded 3,500 vessels sunk by U-boats during the war, the hunter-killer losses were relatively modest. The strategic exchange ratio overwhelmingly favored the Allies. Individual acts of heroism and sacrifice marked hunter-killer operations throughout the campaign. Lieutenant Albert David, who led the boarding party that captured U, received the Medal of Honor for his courage in entering a flooding, potentially booby-trapped submarine that could have sunk at any moment. Lieutenant Commander John Jack Roberts, flying from USS Bogue, attacked and sank U-128 on May 17, 1943, but was shot down by the submarine's anti-aircraft fire during his attack run. Roberts and his crew were killed, but their depth charges destroyed the submarine. Lieutenant Robert Bob Williams, the night attack pioneer from USS Card, flew over 120 combat missions against U, sinking 3 and damaging several others before being killed. When his aircraft crashed during a night landing in October 1943, these men and hundreds like them embodied the aggressive spirit that made hunter-killer operations successful. The tactical innovations pioneered by groups influenced anti-submarine warfare doctrine for decades after World War II. The concept of a mobile, self-contained task force combining aviation and surface, Assets became the foundation for carrier battle groups and anti-submarine warfare task forces in the Cold War and beyond. The integration of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and strike capabilities demonstrated that maritime patrol and prosecution could be more effective than static defense. Modern naval doctrine regarding submarine hunting draws directly from lessons learned by USS Guadalcanal and Guadalcanal 75 years ago. The use of helicopters operating from destroyers and cruisers, the coordination between fixed-wing patrol, aircraft, and surface ships, the concept of barrier patrols to intercept submarines in transit areas all trace their lineage to World War II hunter-killer groups. The strategic impact extended beyond military operations. By securing the Atlantic sea lanes, hunter-killer groups enabled the buildup of American military power in Britain that made D-Day possible. The 2 million American troops transported to Britain in 1943-1944, along with millions of tons of supplies, equipment, and vehicles, crossed an Atlantic that was no longer dominated by Dinitz's submarine fleet, which had come within months of strangling Britain in 1942, was by 1944 reduced to a strategic irrelevance. Germany's inability to interdict Allied logistics meant that the vast industrial and military superiority of the Allied powers could be brought to bear on the European battlefield without meaningful interference. This was the ultimate measure of hunter-killer success, not just submarines sunk, but strategic victory achieved. As we examine the records and after-action reports from these operations 70 years later, certain patterns emerge clearly. The hunter-killer group succeeded because they solved the fundamental problem of anti-submarine warfare, finding submarines in the vast ocean. By combining escort carriers that provided mobile air search capability with destroyer escorts that could prosecute contacts, they created a system that could search 100,000 square miles of ocean per patrol and kill submarines with unprecedented efficiency. They succeeded because commanders like Galleries, Bell, and Short were given operational freedom to develop tactics and take calculated risks. They succeeded because industrial capacity provided the ships and aircraft needed to implement the concept at scale. And they succeeded because thousands of sailors and aviators executed dangerous missions with skill, courage, and determination day after day for years until victory was achieved. The final statistics tell the story numerically. Between March 1943 and May 1945, American escort carrier hunter-killer groups conducted 180 patrols, encompassing approximately 6,000 days at sea. During these patrols, they sank 63 U-boats confirmed, with several more probables that could not be verified. British escort carrier groups sank an additional 21 U-boats during dedicated hunter-killer operations. Combined, hunter-killer groups accounted for approximately 84 confirmed submarine kills, representing about 11% of total U-boat losses during that period, while constituting less than 5% of Allied anti-submarine forces deployed. This force multiplication ratio demonstrated that the concept was not merely successful but strategically decisive in disproportionate measure to resources invested. German patrol reports from 1944 document this psychological deterioration. Commanders reported crews refusing to surface even when batteries were critically low, engineers reporting phantom mechanical problems that required returning to base, and junior officers openly questioning whether patrol orders were essentially death sentences. The elite submarine force that had terrorized the Atlantic in 1942 had by 1944 become a force more concerned with survival than combat effectiveness. Morale collapsed as crew after crew departed on patrol and never returned. The U-boat arm that began the war with volunteers competing for positions had by 1945 resorted to assigning men from other branches against their will, and even then could barely maintain crew strength as casualties mounted. Hunter-killer groups had achieved what conventional escorts never could. They had made submarine operations psychologically unsustainable for the men who had to execute them. The tactical evolution of specific hunter-killer techniques deserves detailed examination because these innovations represented genuine military creativity under pressure. The ladder search pattern developed by USS Corps task group involved flying aircraft in a series of parallel search legs perpendicular to suspected U-boat transit routes, creating a barrier patrol that submarines would have to cross to reach their operational areas. When a submarine was detected transiting through the ladder, aircraft would attack immediately while radioing position to surface ships, which would converge on the contact from multiple directions, cutting off escape routes. This tactic proved devastatingly effective in transit zones where U-boats had to follow predictable routes to avoid Allied-controlled choke points. Between July and December 1943, Corps' task group sank 7 U-boats using ladder search tactics in the central Atlantic, each kill resulting from coordination between air search, air attack, and surface prosecution. The creeping attack technique, adapted for hunter-killer operations, involved an aircraft maintaining radar or visual contact with the submarine while directing a destroyer escort to the target from beyond sonar range. The submarine, focused on the aircraft above, often failed to detect the approaching surface ship until too late. The destroyer escort would approach slowly and quietly, minimizing propeller noise, while the aircraft updated the submarine's position continuously. When the destroyer reached weapons range, the aircraft would make a strafing run or drop a depth charge to force the submarine to maneuver, breaking any acoustic stealth it might have maintained. Immediately after, the destroyer escort would attack with hedgehog or depth charges, catching the submarine in the moment of maximum vulnerability, when it was maneuvering defensively against the aircraft and not yet aware of the surface threat. This technique accounted for at least 18 confirmed kills between mid-1943 and early 1945, demonstrating that coordination and timing could be as lethal as firepower. Night operations, pioneered by USS Guadalcanal and later adopted by other groups, represented perhaps the most significant tactical innovation because they denied U-boats their last sanctuary. German submarine doctrine from 1942 onward relied heavily on night surface transits and battery charging. Submarines would submerge before dawn, remain deep throughout daylight hours to avoid aircraft detection, then surface after dusk to run diesel engines at full power, recharging batteries and making maximum transit speed toward patrol areas or back to base. This pattern was so predictable that experienced hunter-killer commanders could position their task groups in likely surfacing areas and wait for submarines to appear at dusk. The development of reliable night-flying capabilities by escort carrier pilots shattered this pattern. Avengers equipped with radar could detect surfaced submarines from 10 to 15 miles at night, approach using radar guidance while maintaining complete darkness, then illuminate the target with searchlights at the last moment before releasing depth charges. The submarine, blinded by searchlights and with no time to dive, faced almost certain destruction. Lieutenant Commander John Corney Ballard, flying from USS Guadalcanal on the night of October 5, 1943, exemplified night attack effectiveness when he detected UFO-22 on radar at 14 miles. Ballard approached without lights, using only his radar scope to guide his approach. At 1 mile, traveling at 240 knots just above wavetop height, he switched on his powerful searchlight. U-422 was fully illuminated, caught on the surface with lookouts frozen in shock at the blinding light. Ballard's 4 depth charges exploded alongside and under the submarine's hull. When Ballard circled back and illuminated the area again with parachute flares, U-422 was gone, leaving only spreading oil, debris, and one survivor who was picked up by destroyer Escort Bori the following morning. The survivor reported that the submarine had broken in half from the depth charge explosions and sank in less than 20 seconds. The crew had no time to react, no opportunity to fight back or escape. Night attacks like this killed at least 23 U-boats between August 1943 and March 1945, representing nearly 1/3 of all hunter-air kills. The coordination between multiple hunter-killer groups operating in adjacent patrol areas created overlapping coverage that maximized search efficiency. By 1944, the U.S. Navy maintained 4 to 6 escort carrier task groups on station simultaneously in the Atlantic, each covering a patrol box approximately 200 by 300 miles. These boxes were positioned in critical areas, approaches to British ports where U-boats tried to intercept convoys, mid-Atlantic transit routes where submarines traveled between bases and operational areas, and off the coasts of France and Norway where submarines departed and returned from patrol. A submarine transiting from Brest to its patrol area in the mid-Atlantic might pass through 3 different hunter-killer patrol zones, facing detection and attack risk throughout its entire journey. This layered defense meant that even if a submarine evaded one hunter-killer group, it would likely encounter another within hours or days. The operational freedom that U-boats had enjoyed in 1940–1942, when they could transit relatively safely to patrol areas before engaging convoys, had been completely eliminated by the overlapping coverage of hunter-killer groups in 1944–1945. The Atlantic's vast distances created logistical challenges that required innovative solutions. A hunter-killer patrol typically covered 4,000 to 6,000 miles, over 30 to 40 days at sea. Escort carriers carried fuel for approximately 40 days of operations at cruising speed, but their destroyer escort screens had shorter endurance, typically 3,000 to 3,500 miles at cruising speed. This necessitated refueling at sea from fleet oilers, a complex and dangerous operation in heavy Atlantic weather. The escort carrier and oilers would steam on parallel courses about 100 feet apart, close enough to stretch fuel hoses between them, but far enough to avoid collision if either ship maneuvered suddenly. Heavy seas could snap fuel hoses, drench both ships with spray, and make the operation impossible for hours or days. Yet without effective refueling at sea, hunter-killer groups could not maintain station in their patrol areas long enough to be effective. U.S. Navy fleet oilers like USS Kennebec and USS Chinook became unsung heroes of the hunter-killer campaign, steaming 200,000 miles and transferring millions of gallons of fuel to task groups operating in some of the most hostile ocean on Earth. The human dimension of hunter operations extended beyond the statistics and tactics to the daily lives of men operating in one of warfare's most demanding environments. Escort carrier crews lived in cramped quarters with minimal amenities. Fresh food ran out within 2 weeks of departure, after which meals consisted of canned and dried provisions. Fresh water was rationed strictly, with showers limited to 2 minutes per week. Laundry facilities were minimal, and most sailors washed their own clothes in salt water using harsh detergent that barely worked. Sleeping quarters were hot, humid, and crowded, with bunks stacked 3 high and ventilation barely adequate. Yet morale remained generally high because the crews understood their mission's importance and took pride in their effectiveness. The knowledge that their operations were directly saving Allied lives by killing submarines that would otherwise attack convoys provided purpose and motivation that transcended physical discomfort. Fighter pilots and bomber crews faced unique psychological pressures. Each patrol flight lasted 4 to 6 hours over featureless ocean where navigation airs could leave an aircraft unable to find its carrier, with ditching in frigid Atlantic water meaning death from exposure within minutes. Pilots flew aircraft that had minimal redundancy in critical systems. A single engine failure over the ocean far from the carrier was often fatal. Yet these same pilots volunteered for night missions, bad weather searches, and attacks on heavily armed submarines that could and did shoot down attacking aircraft. The casualty rate among escort carrier aviators was approximately 8% per year, meaning a pilot could statistically expect to survive 12.5 years of combat operations, which was cold comfort given that patrols lasted continuously for years. Yet pilots continued flying, attacking submarines whenever found, pushing their aircraft and themselves to operational limits because they understood that every U-boat sunk meant merchant seamen who would not drown in burning oil, soldiers who would receive their supplies, and a war that would end sooner rather than later. Destroyer escort crews faced their own unique dangers. Operating within torpedo range of submarines for weeks at a stretch required constant vigilance and nerves that never relaxed. Sonar operators listened through headphones hour after hour, identifying acoustic contacts that might be submarines, whales, thermoclines, or any of dozens of other phenomena that produced sounds in the ocean. Lookouts scanned the seas in all weather, watching for periscope wakes, torpedo wakes, or the subtle disturbances that might indicate a submarine preparing to attack. Depth-charge crews stood ready to launch weapons on seconds' notice, working with explosives powerful enough to damage their own ship if something went wrong. Gun crews remained at their stations during action, exposed to weather and enemy fire, ready to engage surfaced submarines or aircraft. The physical and mental exhaustion of maintaining this level of readiness for weeks became overwhelming. Yet crews performed their duties because failure meant death not just for themselves but for the carrier they were protecting. and the mission they were prosecuting. The intelligence dimension of hunter-killer operations represented warfare's cutting edge in 1943 to 1945. Ultra-intercepts of German Enigma communications provided hunter groups with information that seemed almost clairvoyant. Submarine patrol orders, position reports, weather observations, and tactical communications were being read by Allied codebreakers, sometimes within hours of transmission. This intelligence was processed, analyzed, and forwarded to hunter-killer groups at sea with remarkable speed. A U-boat commander reporting his position to headquarters in France might find hunter-killer aircraft appearing over his position within 6 to 8 hours, guided by intelligence derived from his own transmission. The Germans never fully realized that Enigma had been compromised, attributing submarine losses to radar, direction finding, and random chance rather than systematic code-breaking. This allowed the intelligence advantage to persist throughout the war, giving hunter-killer groups an edge that German commanders could neither understand nor counter. The final months of the war saw hunter-killer operations reach their apex of effectiveness even as their strategic importance diminished. By January 1945, U-boat operations had been so degraded that submarines posed minimal threat to Allied logistics. Yet hunter-killer groups continued their patrols, sinking submarines until the final days of the European War. USS Mission Bay sank U-546 on April 24, 1945, just 2 weeks before Germany's surrender. USS Croaton's aircraft sank U-1235 on April 15, 1945. These late war kills had little strategic impact because Germany's defeat was already certain, but they represented the complete mastery of anti-submarine warfare that hunter-killer groups had achieved. Submarines that sorted in early 1945 faced near-certain destruction. Survival had become exceptional. Death routine. The hunter-killer concept had evolved from experimental innovation in 1943 to dominant doctrine by 1945, achieving effectiveness that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The human legacy of hunter-killer operations lives on through the veterans who served and the families who remember them. Escort carrier crew reunions continued for decades after the war, with aging sailors gathering to remember ships, shipmates, and operations that had seemed routine at the time, but appeared extraordinary in retrospect. The courage required to conduct flight operations in Atlantic storms, hunt submarines that could kill you with a single torpedo, and maintain aggressive pursuit for days or weeks until the enemy was destroyed, deserved recognition that often came belatedly. Many escort carrier sailors and aviators received no decorations beyond the standard campaign medals awarded to all who served in the Atlantic theater. Their contributions were overshadowed by the dramatic battles in the Pacific, the strategic bombing campaign over Germany, and the ground campaigns that captured public attention and historical memory. Yet their achievements were equally significant in their sphere. They transformed defensive convoy escort into offensive submarine hunting. They drove the U-boat fleet from the Atlantic through relentless pressure and superior tactics. They enabled Allied logistics to function without meaningful interdiction, making victory in Europe possible. None of the famous hunter-killer destroyer escorts survive today as museums, their contributions remembered primarily through documentation, photographs, and the memories of those who served aboard them. As we reflect on hunter-killer operations, 80 years after their development, certain lessons emerge that transcend their specific historical context. Innovation in military affairs often comes from questioning fundamental assumptions about how warfare must be conducted. The assumption that escorts must stay with convoys seemed unquestionable, until someone asked whether dedicated hunting groups might be more effective. Technological advantage alone rarely determines outcomes. The hunter-killer group succeeded because they integrated technology with doctrine, intelligence with operations, and courage with calculated risk-taking. Smaller, cheaper platforms, escort carriers, and destroyer escorts proved more effective for specific missions than larger, more expensive alternatives, demonstrating that appropriate design matters more than absolute capability. Most importantly, aggressiveness and initiative consistently defeated caution and reaction in submarine warfare. Groups that hunted aggressively and pursued contacts relentlessly achieved results far exceeding those that operated cautiously or broke off attacks prematurely. The mathematical reality of hunter-killer effectiveness remains striking even decades later. 84 confirmed submarine kills from approximately 6,000 patrol days at sea means one U-boat destroyed for every 71 days of operations. Given that each patrol typically involved one escort carrier and 4 to 6 destroyer escorts, this represents approximately 500 ship days of operations per kill. Compare this to convoy escort operations, where thousands of escorts operating over years achieved kill rates far lower despite encompassing vastly more ship days at sea. The efficiency difference was not marginal but transformational, demonstrating that the hunter-killer concept represented genuine innovation rather than incremental improvement. These numbers justified every dollar invested in escort carrier construction, every hour spent training pilots in night carrier operations, and every risk accepted by crews operating in the Atlantic's hostile environment. The closing months of the European War in spring 1945 saw groups operating with near impunity across the Atlantic. German submarine operations had collapsed to the point that U-boats were more likely to be sunk during their first patrol than to survive and return to base. New commanders were being sent on patrol with minimal training because experienced commanders were nearly all dead or captured. Crew quality had degraded as casualties mounted and replacements became increasingly scarce. The technological advantages that Germany hoped would restore submarine effectiveness, said Vance Type 21 and Type 23. Submarines with improved underwater performance arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the outcome. Hunter-killer groups owned the Atlantic, patrolling vast areas with the confidence that any submarine detected would be destroyed. This operational dominance, achieved in just 2 years from the first tentative hunter-killer patrols in early 1943, represented one of warfare's most dramatic strategic reversals. The U-boat arm that had nearly strangled Britain in 1942 was by 1945 a spent force, destroyed not primarily through attrition, but through innovative doctrine that transformed submarine hunting from reactive defense to aggressive prosecution. The story of hunter groups is ultimately a story about adaptation, innovation, and the courage to attempt operations that seemed impossible, creating mobile task forces around small aircraft carriers that skeptics called floating death traps, sailing them into submarine-infested waters, and conducting aggressive hunts over millions of square miles of ocean represented audacity that bordered on recklessness. Yet it worked. The concept worked because it was properly resourced with adequate numbers of ships and aircraft. It worked because commanders were given operational freedom to develop tactics and take calculated risks. It worked because intelligence support provided actionable information about enemy positions and movements. It worked because training prepared crews and pilots for the harsh realities of Atlantic operations. And it worked because the men who executed these operations possessed courage, skill, and determination that sustained them through dangers and hardships that would have broken lesser warriors. The hunter-killer groups of World War II demonstrate that military innovation succeeds when vision, resources, doctrine, intelligence, technology, and human courage combine in pursuit of clear strategic objectives. These lessons remain relevant today and will continue resonating wherever military forces seek to master their environment and defeat determined enemies through innovation and aggressive action.